Plates come in different shapes and sizes, as we kind of saw in that first diagram. And we want to know something about how they move and what kinds of motions produce certain types of features that we see on our planet. The study of plate motions is called plate kinematics, and I'm probably not going to really ask that you remember that word, but if you want to think about it in terms of like kinesiology for crust, I know some of you are kinesiology majors, that's where that word comes from. Plates moving, or the study of plates moving. It's the motions of the plates relative to each other that cause all these different kinds of things that we talked about earlier. Mountains, volcanoes, earthquakes, throwing up of huge mountain ranges, submarine trenches, all those kinds of things. So a look at the plate boundaries, where the plates meet with each other, and how those plates interact with each other can tell us something about the kinds of features that we can expect to see in a particular place. As I said earlier, a given plate includes both continental crust and oceanic crust, okay, in different proportions. The Pacific plate here, there's actually some parts of it here as well, is almost entirely oceanic crust, whereas the Eurasian plate is largely made up of continental crust. And these plates, where they meet, where we see these black lines, these are the plate boundaries. So a lot of important things happen at those plate boundaries. So now let's take a look at how plate tectonics accounts for some of Earth's geographic features. There's three different types of plate boundaries. Divergent boundaries are where two plates move apart or away from each other, just like two roads diverging in a woods. That's a poem from somebody, Carl Sandburg, I believe. Convergent boundaries are where two plates come together. Okay, so convergence, coming together. Divergence, going apart. And then transform boundaries are where two plates slide by slide. So we really have three different types of motions. We have moving apart, coming together, and side by side. Well, here's an example of a divergent boundary. And divergent boundaries are the ones that you find at oceanic ridges, like the Mid-Atlantic Ridge. The ridge, and when I say ridge, I'm talking about a mountain range that moves, that we find in the middle of the ocean basins. Here the plates move apart. They separate from each other as indicated in this figure that you'll find in your book, figure 3.8. Moving apart, a divergent boundary, oceanic ridges. Remember those types of things. That's the most familiar type of divergent boundary. We also find divergent boundaries on land. Here's one in Ecuador. It's where continents kind of come apart in a sense. The Red Sea is another example of a divergent boundary, a continental rift zone, a continental divergent boundary. And here you can actually see Earth moving in, the plates moving in two different directions, creating this kind of valley, what's called a rift valley, and it's happening slowly. The plates move at about the rate that your fingernails grow, but in fact Earth is extending here, and the two plates are moving in different directions, they're diverging from each other. The same kind of thing is happening on Iceland, and if you saw a Journey to the Center of the Earth, you might have seen some nice pictures of a similar kind of continental rift zone. Where plates come together, that's a zone of convergence, or a convergent boundary. Plates are colliding with each other. And an example of that is happening up along the Aleutian Islands in Alaska, where the Pacific plate is being thrust underneath the North Atlantic plate. There's other examples, the Mariana Trench, the deepest place in the ocean, where the Pacific plate is diving underneath the Philippines plate. We find many examples of convergent boundaries, and we're going to talk a little bit more about them because convergent boundaries are a little bit more complicated. They come in a few different types, but they're really important for understanding the kinds of things that we see on land and underneath the ocean as well. Mount Everest, the Himalayas, is an example of where two plates have collided, and that collision between those two plates has thrown up the highest mountains on Earth. So here we have a great example in the Himalayas, where home to Mount Everest, where plate tectonics has created one of the most extraordinary features that we find on the surface of our planet. Well, closer to home, we live on a transform fault. That's where two plates slide next to each other. And lest you think that the sliding of plates is a little bit less sort of rancorous than the coming together of plates, think about the kind of earthquakes we have here. Just because two plates are sliding next to each other doesn't mean we're not going to have big earthquakes. So all of these boundaries, except perhaps for the divergent boundary, but both the convergent boundary and the transform boundary, or the transform faults, can create pretty severe earthquakes. So here we see in figure 3.8 two plates sliding next to each other, and of course the example of that, the best example of it, is the San Andreas Fault where we live, where the North American plate is sliding next to the Pacific plate. And actually that would be the opposite kind of, the North American plate is actually moving sort of this way relative, if you're doing this directionally, relative to the Pacific plate. Here in LA, where we live on the Pacific plate, Orange County, Los Angeles, we're actually headed towards San Francisco, which is on the North American plate. So you get the idea. See the San Andreas Fault, and you can see this massive feature, this where two plates come together. Here's the North America plate, here's the Pacific plate, and here they're sliding next to each other. And you can, in fact, if you look at this sort of river channel here, or I think it's a river channel, not a road, you can actually see that it's been offset. This used to be straight across, but as the Pacific plate creeps this way and the North America plate creeps that way, we get these offset channels due to that effect. So you can actually see evidence of where plates have moved, and that's one piece of evidence that tells us that the theory of plate tectonics really is supported by what we observe. Okay, if we take a sort of longer look at it, or an illustrated view of it, we can see that the San Andreas Fault actually connects with some oceanic ridges. Here we have the Juan de Fuca Ridge. We talk a lot about the Juan de Fuca Ridge. It's off the coast of Washington here. It's a really exciting place right now in terms of geological studies and hydrothermal vents and those kinds of things. So keep it in the back of your mind, the Juan de Fuca Ridge, just so you kind of know where it is when I mention that. And we see that it also, this San Andreas Fault connects the East Pacific Rise. The East Pacific Rise is sort of the Pacific Ocean equivalent of the Mid-Atlantic Ridge. It's a divergent boundary, a place where we have an oceanic ridge. So you can see that these transform faults kind of act like connector routes or connector faults between, in this case, oceanic ridges. And that again is something to kind of keep in mind as we explore the seafloor. Well, as promised, we're going to take a little bit closer look at divergent boundaries. They really come into two types, or three or four different types actually. Let's go back to that. Well, let's take a little bit closer look at these boundaries. Divergent boundaries actually come in two broadly different kinds of types depending on how fast the plates are moving apart. Remember, I called that process of plates moving apart seafloor spreading, because it's happening on the seafloor and the plates are spreading apart. Slow spreading ridges, like the Mid-Atlantic Ridge, actually develop that rift valley. That kind of valley that I showed you there in Ecuador is an example of the kind of valley that you find on the top of the mountain range, which we call the Mid-Atlantic Ridge. And that's a result of slow spreading ridges. Fast spreading ridges, like the East Pacific Rise, lack that central valley. So one of the features that we expect to see on oceanic ridges is a rift valley or no rift valley. And here we have an example where the rate at which the plates are spreading or moving apart kind of determines what we'll see on a particular oceanic ridge. So here we see this process, this plate divergence, is creating a feature that we see on the seafloor. And the explanation for the rift valley in the Mid-Atlantic Ridge and no rift valley in the East Pacific Rise has to do with just how fast they're spreading apart.